Brent, CONSTANTZ, founder and CEO. Here at Blue Planet, we convert carbon dioxide to carbonate for carbonate minerals and carbonate rocks, and these rocks are used for the aggregate in concrete, both the fine aggregate as sand and coarse aggregate as gravel. And it allows you to store CO2 in the crystalline form as carbonate in the built environment. It's one of the few mechanisms for managing carbon that's actually profitable and can pay for itself and has broad-reaching implications, because rock, other than water, is the largest mass material movement on the planet already. And all of the infrastructure necessary to move the rock is already in place. So it's a gigaton scale solution that we can implement in less than a decade on a global basis.
And what's different about your process to other processes that are out there?
Well, historically, the capturing of CO2 has been a first step in a process to concentrate it down to 100% so that it can be liquefied and transported in pressurized vessels and pipelines, mostly for enhanced oil recovery, to inject into oil reservoirs to push more oil out. As we've looked at the larger volumes of CO2 that need to be managed, most everyone in the industry is still focused on how to capture it and concentrate it to a liquid. From companies doing what's called direct air capture, they're still trying to purify it to a liquid, to companies turning it into jet fuel, are still trying to turn it into a liquid. It turns out, thermodynamically, that's the opposite direction you want to go. It's a very energy intensive thing to do, and it turns out there's really no market for purified CO2. There are companies like Praxair and Air Liquide and Air Products that have been selling it for 100 years, and there's really no room for it. If you look at carbon on Earth, there's about 700 gigatons of carbon in Earth's atmosphere. You know, this 80,000 foot thick, envelope of gas around the Earth. But there's about 5,000 gigatons of carbon in the whole biosphere, all the rainforests and phytoplankton in the oceans. There's about 38,000 gigatons of carbon in the hydrosphere and all the lakes, rivers, oceans, and ice caps. But there are about 50 million gigatons of carbon in the lithosphere, mostly in the form of limestone. And so almost all of Earth's carbon is in limestone. And the way it got there is from marine organisms, skeletons like corals in the White Cliffs of Dover, the Great Barrier Reef, clamshells. Those are all the skeletal remains of marine organisms. And the carbon got to them by diffusing from the atmosphere across the interface of the atmosphere and the ocean into the water. And that's coming from a very dilute concentration, not a concentrated concentration. So for instance, the air we're breathing is about 0.04% or 400 parts per million carbon dioxide. And that's the state at which it normally is diffusing spontaneously and equilibrating between the atmosphere and the ocean. And that's what Blue Planet does. So we can take any form of carbon dioxide and we can transform it into carbonate at any concentration, because we're not trying to purify it into CO2. So that's one of the primary fundamental differences in what we do.
So would you, without being dramatic, would you define this as a game changer?
Yeah, it is a game changer in the sense of what humans are doing today. But at the same time, it's where 99.99% of all the carbon has the process, the capture of carbon is followed naturally. Yeah. So we call it geomimetic, because we're mimicking a geologic process. But yeah, it's certainly a game changer, because a key difference is it uses very little energy. It's a spontaneous reaction as opposed to trying to purify it, which is just the opposite, an uphill reaction that takes a lot of energy.
Okay. So kind of a mixed question here, but how, actually, are you doing okay here, Pat?
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay, great, yeah. Commercialization, sustainability, and scale. Could you just address those things?
Well, there's a recent book by Fikowski that points out three critical factors to really address the problem we're trying to address. And one is permanency. So the ability to take carbon dioxide and permanently remove it from the atmosphere, which turns out mineralization is one of the best ways to do that. Other than carbon itself, limestone is one of the most stable forms you can put carbon in. Another one is scalability. And nothing except water itself has been scaled to this degree. So any port, any loading area you go to in the whole world today has the ability to move massive amounts of rock as economically as possible. And a third factor that he mentions, which is critical to the whole thing working in every country in the world, is that it be economical. You know, there are many schemes being developed that are solely dependent on government subsidies or voluntary markets. And none of these things have long-term sustainability or the actual ability to scale to the level. There's not enough money, it turns out, to pay people not to emit CO2. But if it's part of their regular business, which it can be in the poorest country in the world or the richest country in the world, it can go global. If it doesn't work in India and China, forget about it. It's not really going to make any difference anyway. And so it has to be economic. And those three factors are really matched beautifully. I would add the fourth, that it has to be implementable by 2030. Because there's some fantastic ideas out there, but they're sort of 2070, 2080 sorts of solutions, and we'll all be long gone by then.
Yeah. Can we just ground the scalability by talking about some of the commercial ventures that you're involved in?
You mean previously, or?
Oh, no, sorry. You mentioned before that there's a kind of a licensing
yes,
model,
okay,
and yeah, on that level.
Yeah, so we're looking at a few different business models, all to pursue in parallel. And they really adapt to the way the carbon's being presented and the way it's being commercialized. So one aspect, or what we call captive models, we have quite an intellectual property portfolio, and we have the ability to license that out. So about a month ago, Holcim, the largest non-Chinese cement company, announced their partnership with Blue Planet. And Holcim has about 200 cement plants around the world. And near those plants, they also have all the transportation. They have their own aggregate quarries, and they have their own concrete plants. And concrete is the marketed product. And so they have the ability to simply license the technology and pay us a royalty. There are other cases where we're going out to ports where there are many different CO2 emitters and many different raw material off-takers that already have all the infrastructure in place to work together, but we're going to be bringing them together. An example of that would be, say, a refinery that's making hydrogen. And say for blue hydrogen production, there's a lot of CO2 produced. It's usually coming from a refinery. And the refinery has no ability to get into the rock business or sell concrete, so they need those partnerships. So we're working in Singapore, Houston, a number of major ports around the world establishing these. And there are some cases like our plant here on San Francisco Bay where we just own 100% of it. We're operating it. We're going to continue to own it and operate it. But there are about 5,000 places around the world where you could do this at over 1 million tons a year. So we know we're not going to manage them all ourselves, but we'll be creating these special purpose vehicles throughout the world.
Can I just bring this round to, you still okay?
Yeah, 6 minutes.
Yeah, we should grab this. Just on a personal level, what this means to you, I mean, in terms of the legacy that you leave behind.
Well, I've always been attracted toward big problems. So my first 3 companies that I founded were all medical companies. And the principal, 2 of them addressed hip fractures and other osteoporotic fractures, which are the largest healthcare expense in the world. And so I was really interested in that. One of my companies was a heart surgery company. And you know, the type of heart disease we attacked is the leading cause of death. And in coming to work on carbon and mineralizing carbon, it seemed like the biggest problem that I could possibly work on. So that's really what interested me in changing from medical to climate change.
That's great. Thank you. Anything that you'd like to add? Or?
Oh,